TJ, and today I will be doing an interview with the creator of Vamps. Please, sir, tell us your name, about your product, and the history of your product.
My name is Jim Eckels. I'm the creator and writer of Vamp. It's a comic book about a casino run by vampires in Las Vegas. And the main character is Julian Smith, and he is the vampire's personal cleaner.
So, how did you get into this line of work? Like, what got you interested in being a comic book writer?
It's been quite a meandering path to making this comic book. So I moved out to LA in '98 to be a screenwriter, and had written one of the worst screenplays unknown to man, I guess, because no one read it, but it was terrible. But I wanted to be a writer. So I came to LA, wrote a bunch more scripts, got better, got a bunch of agents and managers, but nothing ever hit. It's like horseshoes and hand grenades, for me anyway, in this town. It always feels very, very close, but never quite explodes in the way you want it. So, to make a living, I've been working in reality TV for the past 15 years or so. But one of the pilots that I wrote it's been 2005 or 6, was Vamp. It was a TV pilot, 1 hour. And at that time, they were actually 4 acts, not 6. So this was a long time ago. I pitched that around town. I had some interest, it was exciting, and then nothing happened with it, which is typical. And then, of course, the whole vampire craze hit soon after. I mean, there was True Blood and Vampire Diaries and everything vampire hit everywhere. And that market, which is a niche market to begin with, became very saturated. So I couldn't even bring the script up to my manager or anybody, and they would just be like, dude, stop, vampires are disgusting right now, please don't talk about them. So I put it away and I didn't think about it, but I always really liked that script. So years later, this must have been 2014 or 2015. It was 2014 maybe. A good friend of mine had started an indie comic label, publishing company called Mythos with his friend. And they had a couple titles.
For what this is, Mythos, vampires, all interesting.
What's that?
Very interesting that Mythos is the publishing that you use vampires for, just considering you're using the mythos of vampires.
Right. Yes. It's a cool title for a company. So anyway, they had a couple titles, and my friend asked me, he said, would you be interested in, he always liked the script. We talked about it, and you know, how it was a bit frustrating that it had no home anymore. He said, have you ever considered, making it into a comic book? And I said I hadn't, but that sounds like an amazing idea. So I had nothing to lose. I mean, it got to the point in my writing career that had never started. Although I had, again, all these meetings and stuff, I'd never made a dime off of writing other than your reality TV and clip shows and things like that. But never any money off of scripted. And I was 46 now, so at the time I was like 39, 40. And it was pretty apparent that I wasn't going to be a staff writer. I wasn't going to be a baby writer on a scripted show. And I had come to the conclusion that if I was going to make anything or do anything, that I would have to do it myself, and nobody was going to come knocking. They hadn't yet, in 20 years. So I think I finally figured it out. So I made this comic with Lewis, and they're a very small indie publishing company. At Comic-Con, they have this is San Diego Comic-Con. They have a small press booth. and they had found an artist named Emmanuel Bazin, who was this French guy that I didn't know. And Louis, my friend's name is Louis, who co-owner of Mythos. He had actually had Emmanuel draw the first 4 or 5 pages of the comic without my knowing. I mean, I guess at the time maybe I was a little hesitant, just because, you know, I'd been holding on to this ugly baby for so long. I wasn't sure. Like, someone says they want your ugly baby, you're like, I don't. Then suddenly you don't want to give it to them. I can't explain it. It's silly. And child psychology. So, and he sent me the 5 pages, and it was. I'd never experienced anything like that. Like, to have something in your head for so long, and then someone sends you back these pages from someone you don't know in France that looked not only like what you've had in your head for so long, but better. It looked cool. I was like, God, I guess it's pretty cool with him doing it. And then we were off, you know, and then we started. So that's how it began.
Very interesting. It's funny you talk about like the vampire craze and stuff, because very similarly, that kind of has an interest like with Spider-Man as well. Spider-Man went through something similar where Stan Lee came to his editor and said, "Hey, I have this hero that I want to publish," and the editor was like, "You spiders, no one likes spiders." So it's interesting that is you had a very similar experience with that, where it's like, oh, no one wants to see a vampire product anymore. But it is interesting, very interesting. So,
yeah, I mean, I couldn't even. I mean, he's not my manager anymore, but of course, but the guy at the time who was representing me, he was just like, dude, will you shut up about this project? He's like, it's too late. He's like, you missed the boat. And that hurt, you know, but we'll see. It's a slow boat, and I still might catch it. We'll find out.
So going around with that, where do you see this project going, like television shows? Because it is originally built from a movie script. Do you see this becoming as big as, like, say, a Marvel Cinematic Universe or so?
I mean, that would be amazing. You know what I mean? I think my expectations are rather low, but not in a bad way. I just think it's taken so long. I've accepted that it's a long journey. Of course, it would be amazing to have this Vamp universe. You know what I mean? Which, with all these characters in my head and this world, you know, and there's other characters that I've come up with, and another comic sort of in that world that's very different, and that would be very exciting, you know, to do that. Mythos, their business model, which is a common model right now, is to make these books, but only do a very limited. Excuse me. Mythos business model, which is very common, is to only make 4 or 5 issues, just a quick run, just to have something printed, so you have an IP, and then pitch that as a film or television project. Well, one of the co-owners of Mythos is Braggy Shute. He's a screenwriter, so he actually has a hand in that world. So yes, the idea is to pitch it as a TV show or a film, or something like that. I mean, it would be pretty remarkable if it started as a TV project, became a comic book, to pitch back as a TV project, and then it's sold, which would be very Hollywood, right? It would be very LA, because, you know, they don't want to buy something that isn't already made, or it has some sort of audience yet, because that's too scary for Hollywood. They don't like risk, even though everything's a risk.
Yeah, me as a film student who's just experienced just a fraction of what it's like for like pitching and all that stuff. So I have a little bit of experience, although not like real stuff. So moving on, like, what's your work process in making just one issue of this?
So making the comic was very satisfying. writing it is always writing is painful for me. I think for a lot of writers it is. As far as I've read other people talking about it, it is painful. It's every once in a while you'll get in a groove and you're feeling good and you're writing, but a lot of the times it's like homework. You're just avoiding it. You're avoiding it. You're avoiding it. You're avoiding it. And then you sit down and you're like, oh yeah, I do have some in my brain. And for me, I'm avoiding it because it's that constant fear of I don't have anything to say or I don't have anything to write. I don't have any ideas. You know what I mean? So I think that's universal. I've heard a lot of people say that. There are these sort of like special cases of like a Stephen King who can just sit down and just blah, 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 but that's not me. But the process so the writing process is pretty standard. The difference might be, it depends what you're writing. If you're writing prose, like a book or a short story, you know what I mean? There's paragraphs, sentence structure. There's no pictures, obviously. If you're writing a screenplay or a teleplay, it's dialogue, it's action lines, it's slug lines. And there's a format, For comic book scripts, there isn't a format per se. And I think, I've never worked for any of the big companies like Marvel or anything like that. It's just been this indie one that I paid for along with Mythos. So I realized I could do whatever I want. But a format could be you have your page and you literally write in the panels. So you have to mentally block out panels in your head, panel 1, and you write out just what happens, So it's a different, I've always written in a visual way. Like it's hard for me to write anything until I see it, Then I feel like once I see it, I'm just sort of copying what I see onto a page, you know what I mean? That's my process. So it's hard for me. Sometimes you got to write when you can't see anything. You just got to get in there and then something happens, which I always forget. So the format of the script can be a little different. For mine, as I said, the Vamp pilot was 4 acts. So it broke nicely into 4 issues. And then what I did was I didn't panel it. I didn't say panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. I just looked at each page and in my mind sort of paneled it out. And then once I got to the end of a page, I put a page break. But like a book and like everything else, with these comic scripts and an actual comic, you want people to keep reading, you know what I mean? So you want each page to end in a way that wants them to turn again, you know what I mean? And you can't always do that every time, but that's the idea, right? And the same with a book, you know what I mean? You want to keep what happens next. Now the process of the drawing of it, so Emmanuel had my script. I'd broken it into pages. And like I said, I've worked in reality TV for many years, in post and field. And in post-production, as a producer, I work very closely with editors. They cut something, I look at it, I find pieces for them, I give them suggestions, we go back and forth, and it's a very complimentary way to work. And I like it. And it was even better working with Emmanuel because it was just me and him. There was no boss. I guess I was the boss. I was the boss. I was the boss. It's so hard for you. I was the boss. But there was no network. There was no head of the production company. No notes. Mythos, I'd give it to Lewis and Braggy. And, Braggy was usually very busy. Lewis would weigh in, but it was always sort of minor. So Emmanuel would sketch. What he'd do is he'd probably do anywhere from 1. Sometimes if he got really motivated, he'd do 4 pages, but he'd do anywhere from 1 to 4, usually 1 or 2, and he'd sketch them. He'd sketch them out, paneling them, and he'd send them to me. I'd look at them, and I would send back notes, or ideas, if something didn't make sense to me, or didn't look right. I'd send him back notes. Then he would take my notes, and then usually he would go right to coloring. I think in the beginning, if I remember, he actually would send me the sketches back, but we got comfortable with each other. I got comfortable enough with him that I just tell him it, and then he would do it, you know what I mean? And then he would send it back. And that was it. And what was really wonderful about working with Emmanuel, he just understood the world. He understood the theme, he understood the tone, and his art worked very well for this world. It's kind of dark, it's actually very different looking. If it's not slick, if you look at it, it's almost European. Like, he draws a lot of times no noses, which is strange at first, but it's sort of interesting. And he was really great about taking what I had and making it better. What I appreciated was he just saw what I saw, and I put on the page. He saw what I saw, and then he took what I saw, and he made his own version of it that was even better, and that was fantastic. I told you before, one of the difficulties, and I don't want to say difficulty, a challenge working that closely with one other person is ego. So yeah, I had to, because Emmanuel would do some things that weren't exactly what I said or what I'd written, and I would have to really stop and look at it and say, hey, is this better? And if it's better, it doesn't matter if he did different than what I said. You know what I mean? And I had a lot of internal conversations like that, and it was a good exercise for me, and I trusted him. And I guess it was easier to let go of my baby because I trusted him, and he made good decisions. And sometimes, with an artist or an editor, you just can't, sometimes there's some things I wanted him to do, and he just was like, you'd ask, and then after you ask a couple times if they don't do them, you move on, And it's different too, because I can't draw. I mean, I'll show you some of my sketches, like what I would do sometimes if he didn't understand the paneling or he didn't understand how I wanted something, I would actually sketch my own pages or covers. I did all the covers. I'll send them to you. They're terrible, but they at least enough had the idea of what it was, and then he would be able to see. So, but yeah, it was a really great working relation with him. We never spoke. I never spoke on the phone with Emmanuel. I never met him. I guess I never heard his voice. I never saw his face. It was all email. I've been emailing with Emmanuel since 2015, so 5 years. In fact, when we had to put this up on Comixology is the digital delivery system for comic books. There's a bio for the people. So there's a bio for the artist. There's a bio for the writer. And I told Emmanuel, I need a bio from you and I need a picture. And I thought to myself, I've got him. I'm gonna find out. I'm gonna find out what he looks like finally. Because he refused to do a Zoom with me or anything. Not because he didn't want to talk to me. He said because although he can read English and write it, he said he doesn't speak it. But I said I'm gonna find out what it looks like. So I asked him for a picture, and you know what Emmanuel? So I asked him for a picture, and Emmanuel drew himself and sent me that.
Oh,
so
that's very cool.
Yeah, he got away. So I still don't know who he is. He's the undercover Frenchie.
It's interesting when you have people to work with because you bounce off things like ideas. Like, it's sort of what you could call a filter. Like, you have these ideas, and to you, they're like gold, but you only have yourself to think. But then when you talk to someone, they say, oh, doing this would be different. You have a sort of filter to bounce off of. It's very interesting how some of the greatest ideas kind of are born from such a good union, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I think that's the hardest thing is anyone who's creating anything, whether you're writing something or you're shooting something or you're painting something, the hardest thing is to expose it. For me, you know what I mean? Again, I can't speak for everyone. For me, it's hard to let that out and to give it to someone because it's not going to be perfect. You know what I mean? And someone else outside is going to be able to see it more clearly. You know what I mean? As you know, Parker, when you're making something, you're very close to it. You're like this. You're so close to it. But yes, so that's why it's important to find readers or people who are going to help you with your work. To find people you trust, who are going to tell you what they think, but they don't have an ulterior motive. You know what I mean? It's like your mom's going to tell you it's great because she's your mom. You know what I mean? She just, but you have to be careful too, because sometimes people are just going to punch it. You know what I mean? They're just going to punch whatever you're doing, because egos are tough. So you got to find someone who you trust, who wants you to do well, but not at the expense of just coddling you. You know what I mean? And that's a good person to work with. But egos get involved. We're human. It's inevitable. You know what I mean? It's just.
I've personally had that type of issue too. Except, I've worked with people, some that have taken my ideas and say, "Oh, that makes it better." Some people that are so stoned in their ideas, where it's like the product ends up being a little altered because the idea didn't go through a proper filter.
Yeah. With notes, I hate notes, and I finally figured out why I hate notes so much. On these reality shows, especially on these reality shows, especially on post, because that's when you get the notes. I mean, the notes would come in, and I would just blow my top. You know what I mean? Like, what? This is absurd. And people would laugh because they would sit around to watch how angry I would get. And I finally figured out why. It's because I don't know how to do them yet. You know what I mean? So when you get notes, one, it means more work, right? And two, I don't know how to do that yet. So I guess that's why the frustration comes out in me. I identified that. And I also did learn about with notes, it's hard. When you get notes, again, it's personal, right? You spend so much time on something, you are going to get defensive initially. So what I do now is I get notes and I read them, and I don't say anything. I don't respond. I just say, "Hey, thanks. I'll look these over." I don't let out any of my craziness yet. I read them. I just wait, and I wait. I don't know, 3-4 days, and I think them over, and inevitably once the emotion disappears and you can think clearly, you find what's going to work, and then you don't have to do all of them, but hey, if they're good notes, they're good notes. Sorry, I went on a notes tangent.
That's okay. Going on with the work progress and all that stuff, what's it like working on this in this type of new environment where everybody's home, and can you still contact people you work with?
Well, are you asking from the terms of? I'll give you both. So for reality television, it's a mess. Some productions have started back up with COVID protocols, but there's much less work out there. So it really has hit the gig industry hard. People who work freelance. But I know that I have a couple friends who are working in post-production. They're doing Zoom calls, and the editors are fine. Editors and writers, they're at home anyway. You know what I mean? They're home. But cam ops, DPs, field producers, they're the ones who are struggling. And even producers in post. Again, I have a good friend who's now running post for a show. And he said it's just strange because part of we talked about before is the dynamic between an editor and a producer, or writer and artist, and the interaction. You know what I mean? But as I say that, look at my relationship with Emmanuel. I never met him. You know what I mean? So it's different, but it can work. It can work. You know what I mean? It's just different. Change is hard, but it can work. Now, in terms of the comic book industry, COVID crushed the industry initially, and the comic book industry has been sort of tentative to begin with, and I didn't really understand why everyone in publishing was so depressed until I published a few comics. There's not much money in it. There really isn't. I mean, you know, a real sobering day was when Vamp won, because we got into Diamond Distributors, who's the distributor for comics nationally. So they have a book, right? Every comic book shop in America looks through the Diamond catalog and says, I want X-Men, I want Batman, I want this, and they can go to the indie section and say, oh, look at this Vamp, I want to order Vamp. I lost my. How bad the industry is. So when we first had Vamp 1 got distributed by Diamond, when we calculated, so Diamond takes a cut, they take their money for distributing it, then they give the vendors a cheaper deal on the comic to buy it, and then I own 40%. I don't even know. I own 40% of the comic, so whatever's left over, I take 40% of that. And I think when we calculated it out, I ended up making, I think it was like 35 or 40 cents a comic. So, and that's also minus the money I put in to pay manuals. So it was very sobering to see that publishing is rough. That's why you see like Marvel and DC, they have these big universes and they have so many titles, right? To make a lot of money, you have to just print all these titles. You can't just have Vamp, you have to have tons. And then the real money is in having those IPs optioned and made into films and television, right? So my long-winded point is the publishing industry has not been doing well to begin with. COVID hit, all those little shops couldn't have people come in to buy their comics anymore. A lot of them went out of business. I remember in March, Vamp 3 was just coming out, and Diamond told us, although retailers had already ordered Vamp 3, they might refund them because, nobody wants all these Vamp comics, these weird indie comics Vamp, when they're going out of business. Luckily that didn't happen. And it's doing better now, shops are open, but COVID was very, very, very rough on the comic book industry, as far as I could see.
Yeah, it is rough with just everything. So, we talked, and what is your kind of like the origin of the story of Vamp? Like, you told us like the idea and stuff, but what about the story? Even before it became a comic book, it was still the idea of the TV show.
So Vamp, I remember I had just finished a meeting and a pitch, and I don't remember what I pitched, but it was Sam Raimi's company. And the details of the story escape me, but I do remember they kind of told me stuff that they were looking for, And then on the drive home, I was taking that and I was just sort of letting my mind wander. And I was thinking about vampires, because I always loved vampires. I mean, I am a big Anne Rice fan. I was a huge, Lost Boys fan. Fright Night is a great movie. I just watched that again. And I started thinking about vampires, and I've always enjoyed telling the stories about the character who never gets the spotlight, right?
Yeah.
The sidekick, or the secondary character, or not the Superman guy in capes who's super strong, but like, the photographer on the ground, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That was always more interesting to me. So I started thinking about vampires, and then the people who served vampires, and I thought, wow, I would like to tell a story about the guy that works for vampires. And from there, the other details came. I mean, this is a point where, I was like in my 30s at this time, so I'd gone to Vegas quite a few times, and that place is filled with vampires. It is terrifying. I mean, it's amazing. It's so fun, but the whole time you're there, you're just feeling your life force getting sucked out of you, and you're just grinning the whole time. So, like most people, I had a love-hate relationship with Vegas. It was very, very fun, but the place it could get dark. You know what I mean? It was very, very it's a trap. Vegas is a trap. So then the Vegas thing came, and then sort of all the other details sort of fell into place. As I started thinking about that. Now, when I do know that when I write a script, it's hard for me, even if I have the idea and whatever, as soon as I have that opening scene in my head, and this might sound redundant, because of course once you have the opening scene, you're going to start writing. But I mean, the whole process doesn't really start. Like, it usually starts with the scene in my head to kick something off. And once I have that, and in this case for Vamp, it was Sarah eating all these frat boys. You know what I mean? While Julian is just in the back smoking a cigarette, like she's out of control.
Yeah, I just recently reread the comics, and it's very he definitely seems like he's numb to it by now. It's almost like when a kid, when a little kid does something and you're like, okay, here he goes again. I can't really stop him. He's always like this way. It's almost like it's that type of mentality, but he's so numb to all the sin and blood and all that stuff, where it's and he even says it that the time he spent on Earth, it's just so numbing to him.
Exactly right. He's and that was, we're talking about plot. The plot is about Stank Casino is run by vampires, and Julian is their personal cleaner. But thematically, it's about being stuck.
Yeah.
Being stuck in a job that you don't really like, being stuck in life, just feeling like you're treading water and you're not happy, but you don't really have the energy or the drive to get out of this quicksand you're in, because it only goes to your neck. You can still breathe, right? So it's okay. I can survive. I make enough money, but there's that underlying unhappiness of and not knowing how to get out of that situation, and that's where I was at the time, and I still find myself, and that's a constant struggle. And also in LA, you really feel like you're surrounded by vampires sometimes, especially when I was dealing with agents and managers and meeting executives and pitching. It was seductive too, you know what I mean? The industry is seductive. So that's what it's about. And it's about Julian. Like you said, he's numb. He's been doing this job for 500 years, and he knows it's not right. You know what I mean? But he's just, this is what he does. What is he supposed to do? It's basically the mob, right? This whole casino is like the mob. He's in it. He makes good money. He's number 2 at the casino. But he knows that it's not what he's supposed to be doing, but he doesn't know how to get out of it. So hence he's very sarcastic and cavalier and sort of aloof, right?
Yeah. I was it seems like it's, when I was reading it, I got a very, Watchmen, John Wick vibe from it, especially, just everything about it, was very dark and noir, and it was very enjoyable to watch, because it's not too, I would say, R-rated, but at the same time, definitely it's a mature book, but it's not where it's forged with all the stuff you would see nowadays. There's so many, you see stuff it's for, just for scaring, or just for this. There's a story behind all these themes and tones, and it's very entertaining to read. And you want to, even though it's one of those stories where you want to cheer for the bad guy, I guess you could say, or at least the anti-hero in this case.
It's funny you say that, because Lewis, who's one of the co-owners of Mythos, my good friend, I never really had maybe I'm numb, because I never had a problem with all this stuff. I understood Julian, because that's why I wrote him, you know what I mean? Of course, it's the expression of where I was, as is Sarah. Sarah's also an expression of me, crazy, wild, out of control. You know what I mean? Id, pure id. But Lewis, he really was like, he's not a good guy. He's like, all these people are dying. I was like, well, I don't know. Like, he's just stuck. Like, so it's just interesting his perspective on it, and mine. But of course, I tried to plant seeds throughout these books of course, he's questioning everything. Like, there's that scene in the mirror, right, where he hears all the voices, which again, that would be a much better television or film scene, right? Because he's at the mirror and he's hearing all the voices from different languages of people begging for mercy and crying for help, and that's his sins revisiting, right? Literally, it's the people who've died on his watch, who've been eaten while he watched, and he's hearing those voices, and that's when he's like, he doesn't know what he is. Like, what am I? Who am I? And that's the other thing in terms of plot. He doesn't know what he is because he's not a vampire. He doesn't drink blood, and yet he does have long life. So that's the big question too: is what is he? Spirit.
Like in this limbo state of like, I'm not a monster like them, but I'm just as bad as them, kind of thing.
Well, he is complicit, right? And it's like he's a vampire too. I mean, metaphorically, he's a vampire. He's feeding off the deaths of these people as well. He's benefiting financially, and but it's eating him, and it's that feeling of like, what am I doing? What am I supposed to be doing? And just feeling stuck, spiritually and physically too.
What would you say is the favorite part of writing this comic book, like development and all that stuff? What, like, do you have a favorite like story, or what was your favorite part of building this universe per se?
I mean, I think I've always loved Sam Raimi and Evil Dead and Army of Darkness. I saw in the theater in like 1993, whenever it came out. And I've always loved the comedy of that, dark comedy.
Yeah.
So I think I and that was one of the things about me figuring out kind of my voice, and that is my favorite part of Vamp. Is it's a dark world. People are getting eaten, and yet there's comedy. I mean, Sarah's eating the frat boys while she plays Avril Lavigne on her iPod. You know what I mean? That's very Tarantino sort of scene too. And the frat boys, I really liked. I was in a fraternity, and it's sort of embarrassing to say it. And they start off as they are sort of cliches, but I liked Bruno a lot because he really is that asshole. You know what I mean? The bully. But I tried to make him heroic. You know what I mean? Like in book 3, I wanted to give him. He lifts up the door. He lifts the door up so that everyone can escape, and he does it selflessly. You know what I mean? He lets everyone go first. So I wanted to give him a little more dynamic, and then of course he ends up going insane and becoming very evil, like truly evil.
Yeah, I noticed like when I was reading it, that he goes through this like mutative state, like when the police or whatever they face this like Goliath type monster, and it's like, how does that happen? Like, is it just the sickness, I guess you could say?
Well, there was
a vampire.
So vampires have been done to death. I mean, no pun intended. And there were a couple things like in this world and in this mythology. I wanted to make things. I want to put my own ideas or stamp on it. One of the things was reproduction. Generally, in vampire stories, a vampire bites a human, drinks their blood, and that person becomes a vampire. So it's like it's a virus. But I thought that was not silly, but it seemed It seemed, if that was the case, everyone would be a vampire in a matter of months. You know what I mean? If every time a vampire fed, that became a vampire, they would run out of food source. And I also tried to come at this from a biological perspective, evolution. You know what I mean? And that wouldn't be good. Like if there are too many wolves and not enough deer or caribou, the wolf dies. So you can't have that. It has to balance it. So in this case, vampires only reproduce through a type of vampire called a mother. And they're very rare and they're very special. And they're actually kept, and this is beyond the story of the first 4 issues, but and these mothers are kept under lock and key by the uber vampire, and he kind of doles them out to different communities when they need to make more vampires. Now, in terms of Bruno, I also wanted to have something where, what were the repercussions of eating another vampire, cannibalism? And in this case, if you drink a vampire's blood, if a vampire drinks another vampire's blood, a dead vampire's blood, because Bruno drinks the dead nurse's blood, it mutates you, and it turns you into this sort of, it turns you into a monster, a mindless, brainless, horrible killer. I also like the idea of that something is scary to vampires. You know, something preys on vampires. So that's what happens to Bruno. He drinks the blood from the dead nurse, and it changes him, and he cocoons, and he comes out as this sort of, creature from the Black Lagoon. Actually, was sort of inspiration to me. Sort of this like green reptilian, disgusting, gross behemoth.
Look very hulking.
Yes. Abomination-esque.
Yeah.
What were we talking about there?
Oh, just it was just, what's your favorite part about
Oh, sorry, I got off track. But yeah, my favorite part was just the comedy juxtaposed with the violence and the sort of heavy themes. I enjoyed. And once you have your characters, I really liked just playing in that world.
So, what would you say is like between your type of tone and your compared to other comic books that you've read throughout the years? So, like different noir comics and so on.
Well, I think the Vamp is an amalgamation of a lot of things. It's a noir story. It's a vampire story. It's a story about Vegas, and then thematically, it's a story about finding your calling. You know what I mean? It's a pretty dark comic in terms of people. These vampires in Las Vegas are feeding on people and bringing them in to, play craps and then get murdered that night. But it's, to me, a kind of hopeful theme about finding out what it is you're supposed to do in this world. And embracing that, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of themes of archetypes of the male and the female archetype of Julian and Sarah, and how they're sort of drawn to each other. He's sort of repressed his emotions. He's sort of dead inside. She's the opposite, right? She's completely emotional, completely lets all her emotions out, rage, love, lust, hunger, and those two are drawn to each other. And she's a
like the comparison that it's like you have the human character who is the machine, but then you have the machine with the most, like just showing that as an example, you have the machine with the most heart.
right. And they're of course, in the noir story, Sarah is the femme fatale. You know what I mean? The girlfriend who's come back in town to cause problems for the hero. But she's more than that. I mean, that's later in the story. But you'll find out that she's not just chaos. She has a purpose, and she's plotting.
And then to wrap up, how would you introduce your book to other people who
Well, people who are into vampires, vampire fans, are just it's a very niche market, right? The vampire stories. So like when I met you at Comic-Con, right?
Yeah.
Anytime a vampire fan would see the booth with Vamp, they would just be like, they would be right here, and they love anything vampires. They love that world. They love the sort of like the sexuality of it, the violence of it. You know what I mean? And so vampire fans are easy. They're like, they see anything with fangs, they're in. You know, I guess the trick is, how do you get people who aren't into vampires to also be interested in the book? Which is the question you're asking. And as I said before, I would say this is a story about finding what it is in this world that you're supposed to do. You know, finding your purpose. You know, under all this stuff of Vegas and the violence and the comedy and the frat boys and Bruno turning into this reptilian monster, it's about finding your purpose. You know what I mean? I find that very hopeful, and that's a classic story, right, of the hero's journey. And then and they're flawed. I mean, Julian is a very flawed person. You know what I mean? He's working for vampires, helping them kill him, and he's having a very a conflict. So.
And then, any advice you would give to someone who's an independent comic book writer?
I can only speak to the path that I've taken so far. Like, I've never submitted I can only speak to the path that I've taken so far. I've never submitted my work to Marvel or DC, or I've never tried to get jobs writing there. The route that I went was I found an artist, or rather an artist was found for me, and I used my own money to get this made. My advice would be, if you believe in something and it's true and you've written yourself into it, and I don't mean literally, like, but if you put your heart and your soul into it and the things you believe, and you express the things, if you have something you want to say, you should do it. You know what I mean? You should do it. And if you have the money, that's great. But not everyone does. There's so many different avenues. You could do a lot of people do Kickstarter, right? I see a lot of comics doing that. In fact, the Keanu Reeves comic coming out is on Kickstarter, which seems sort of silly, right? You got this A-list celebrity helping promote someone to raise money to make a comic. But anyway, there's a lot of, just do it. I mean, that's the hardest part the hardest part is ignoring the voices in your head that are saying, this isn't good, nobody wants to see this, nobody cares. And we all have those voices, and that's the most difficult thing to overcome. You got to ignore those voices and just do it, you know. And I mean, I've had a lot of failure. I mean, that's sort of my middle name is failure, you know. But I've had success. You know, I if nothing else, an idea that was in my head 15 years ago is now printed in a book, and that's very satisfying. What happens with it from here? Hopefully, I make millions of dollars, and everyone has a Vamp doll in their house someday. You know.
Yeah.
But for now, I'm satisfied that this world was realized.
It's a very wondrous, it's a very enjoyable read. Well, thank you for your time, and my name is Parker Jerry, and this has been Revamping Comics.
Thanks, Parker.